It was a Saturday in the town of Bethany. Jesus was at the home of Simon the leper. As he talked with his disciples, a woman entered the room carrying an alabaster jar that held expensive perfume. She went to Jesus and poured it on his head and then on his feet. Indignant, the disciples questioned her actions.
Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor?
But Jesus intervened and warned them of his impending death.
The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial.
Soon after leaving Bethany, Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The city was crowded with pilgrims who had come for the Passover, and many of them assembled along the road to greet him as he arrived.
It's sort of a special triumph because, in reality, more than a triumph, it's a messianic acclamation when he's recognized as the Messiah of Israel.
Those who gathered waved green palms and placed them before him, carpeting his path, an ancient tradition symbolizing victory. Today, our celebration of Palm Sunday begins with the blessing of the palms that will be used in the procession into church. But the joy of this victory would be short-lived. On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Jesus visited the Temple of Jerusalem. There, he worshipped and taught. But his authority and teachings were called into question in these days. The Gospels tell of a trick by the Pharisees and Sadducees to trap him with his own words.
Teacher, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?
Jesus responded by asking them to bring him a coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius. The most common currency at the time of Jesus was the denarius. It was a small silver coin of the Roman Empire with the image and name of the current emperor, Tiberius Caesar. Upon seeing the coin, Jesus asked,
Whose portrait is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.
His response silenced the Pharisees, but further incited the animosity toward him. Aware of the imminent danger, Jesus arranged a secret meeting with his disciples in a secluded location. He shared with them what would be his last meal before his death. Many significant Christian principles and practices are derived from the Last Supper, the culminating event of which was the institution of the Eucharist. The Gospel of John recalls that Jesus washed the feet of all his disciples, including Judas, before the supper began. He went to Simon Peter first.
No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well.
The washing of the feet was done by slaves. But Jesus wanted to show that his messiahship and his mission of salvation was done through service. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but rather to serve.
The tradition continues today, performed every year by the Holy Father at the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome. That same evening, Jesus offered to all the greatest gift, himself. With the institution of the Eucharist, he gives believers his body and his blood, which he sacrificed for the redemption of all sins of all humanity.
Jesus took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins."
After the meal, Jesus went with his disciples to Gethsemane. In the garden, he prayed to the Father. He was overwhelmed with agony and sorrow for the suffering he was about to undertake for us.
Like any of us, he trembles at the thought of what he will have to suffer. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he asks the Father, "If this chalice can pass from me, let it pass." But he adds, as we so rarely do, "Not my will, however, but yours, Father, be done."
Judas arrived and greeted Jesus with a kiss, signaling to the temple guards that the one he kissed was the man they were looking for. The kiss has come to be known as the most treasonous act in history. Jesus was immediately arrested and taken before the Council of Elders, the Sanhedrin. He was interrogated and asked if he was the Son of God. When he responded yes, they promptly accused him of blasphemy, a crime punishable by death.
The Jews didn't have the power to take the life of anyone, and that's why they had to turn him over to the Roman authorities, the only ones with the right to determine life or death.
The next morning, Jesus was brought to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, with the charge of having declared himself a king, and as such, a threat to the Roman Empire.
Essere in qualche maniera re significava
Calling himself a king of any kind meant rebelling against the Roman Empire. It was high treason against the emperor.
Pilate was a politician. He was afraid that Christ in some way was trying to usurp the position of the Roman emperor. Christ could legitimately have said, "Not in the way you mean. I'm not that kind of king," and probably gotten off relatively easily. What Christ actually says at that point is, "Yes, I am a king, and it was for this that I was born."
They asked for him to be put to death. Pilate found no basis for this, and instead had Jesus flogged. Pilate presented Jesus to the people, scourged and with a crown of thorns on his head.
When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man."
Pilate probably had Jesus flogged to present him in a pitiful state to the public, so they would feel compassion for him and plead for his mercy. And Pilate would have forgiven him, or at least stopped the crucifixion. But the elder priests encouraged the people even more to yell out for his death.
Al pueblo para que grite que quieren que sea crucificado.
Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar.
Pilate was afraid and finally agreed to condemn Jesus to death.
He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I'm innocent of this man's blood," he said.
Jesus was led away to be crucified.
Jesús viene cargado.
Jesus was given the cross, which normally was the horizontal part of the cross, not the entire thing.
He was forced to carry this horizontal piece of wood, the patibulum, to the site of the execution, a location called the place of the skull, or Golgotha in Hebrew, Calvary in Latin.
Before the crowds who assemble on Calvary, he is seen to be defeated. He is seen to die the death of a common criminal. He is seen to suffer and to die. The Passion is everything that leads him to that moment.
Today, this journey, known as the Via Crucis in Latin, is commemorated every year on Good Friday. In Rome, the Pope leads a torchlit procession at the Colosseum, the site where many Christians were martyred. There, he meditates on the Stations of the Cross.
Jesus takes up his cross.
Jesus nimmt das Kreuz auf seine Schulter.
Jesús con la cruz a cuestas.
Jesus carrega a cruz.
Todos vienen, cada uno normalmente lleva.
Everyone comes carrying a lit candle, and it's a luminous sight, all the light that each person brings. The gathering is truly amazing because, in a way, faith is the light of the great mystery of our salvation.
Once Jesus reached Calvary, a small sign was attached to his cross. It was the Roman custom. The sign read, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." The sentence was dictated to a scribe by Pilate. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, as was also the custom.
Dicono a Pilato, non scrivi.
They tell Pilate to write that he had said he was the king of the Jews, not that he actually was king of the Jews. On that occasion, Pilate was true to his opinion and would not change what he had written.
En la realidad, termina siendo.
In reality, it becomes the title of Christ, because as Messiah, he effectively was the true king of the Jews, because it was he who gave his blood to save the people of Israel. So that which did not appear true turned out to be true. This is the importance of the Titulus Crucis.
Importancia del Titulus Crucis.
Today, a very ancient Titulus Crucis, perhaps the original, is preserved in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Gerusalemme, in Rome.
Nel 1492 c'erano dei lavori.
In 1492, there was work being done in the attic. The workers were painting the ceiling, and they heard a dull sound with a hammer. They opened this little window, that's how it was called, and they found the famous iron strongbox holding the titulus. Naturally, this discovery caused an uproar. It was obviously taken down and stored in a showcase, after which they began trying to understand what was written there.
Cioè a cercare di leggere quello che era scritto.
The sign, which is 26 centimeters long, 14 high, and 4 centimeters thick, holds tremendous spiritual value. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus was crucified alongside two criminals. he agonized on the cross for hours and then finally gave up his spirit. With the permission of Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took the body of Jesus down from the cross and placed him in a tomb, bringing with them copious amounts of myrrh and aloe, as much as 33 kilograms. The linen shroud he was wrapped in is kept in the city of Turin in northern Italy. It's a linen cloth bearing the image of a man who was scourged, crowned with thorns, crucified, and pierced in the chest with a lance when he was already dead. In 1898, a photograph of the shroud was taken, and the black and white negative revealed a shocking image.
The photographer who took this picture, he didn't expect in the least to see the form of a man come up on film. The form of a man wrapped in a sheet in a manner so comprehensible to our eyes that it was obvious that this picture, what he had taken a picture of, was actually the negative of a body.
The Gospel of John states that the burial cloth that was wrapped around the head of Jesus, the sudarium, was found in the empty tomb alongside the shroud.
There are bloodstains found on the sudarium that match those on the shroud.
The sudarium is now kept in Oviedo, Spain. Scientists continue to investigate the authenticity of both items, but for the faithful, the question of validity has no bearing on their devotion to the holy relics. In 1998, John Paul II went to Turin for the 100th anniversary of the first photograph. Artistic images of the life of Jesus go back to the first centuries of Christianity, but depictions of the crucifixion emerge only much later, in the Middle Ages.
This is due to a simple reason. It's because Jesus Christ underwent a terrible death, crucifixion, the death inflicted on the worst criminals of antiquity, robbers, murderers, and rebels. Because of this, Christians created works where Christ's passion was represented, not in the act of the physical death of our Lord, but instead in his capture, in the phases coming before his last condemnation.
L'ultima condanna. One has to wait for the end of the first millennium and the beginning of the second millennium to find works in which artists really try to depict, even if still in somewhat symbolic terms, the human tragedy of this man who accepts to die in obedience to God the Father and for love of humankind.
In sculpture, in paintings, in mosaics, Rome is home to some of the oldest existing depictions of the events of Jesus' last days in Jerusalem.
The oldest crucifixion that we know of is depicted on the doors of Santa Sabina in Rome.
Di Santa Sabina a Roma.
These carved wooden doors of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill date back to the 5th century. Going further back, to the 3rd century, the catacombs of Pretestato off Rome's Appian Way have paintings of New Testament stories, including a scene from Christ's Passion where he is pictured with 2 Roman soldiers.
It is a Christ crowned with thorns from around the year 260. This could be the oldest representation known today.
La più antica testimonianza fino a oggi conosciuta.
Sarcophagi with scenes from the Passion have been recovered from various catacombs as well as from the Vatican necropolis. This one dates to the 4th century. In the 3rd century, a bishop from Hierapolis named Abercius traveled to Rome. Shortly after his return to Hierapolis, he died, but not before writing his own epitaph. now kept in the Vatican museums. Its text is highly significant because it helps us to better understand the beliefs of the early church, revealing one of the oldest hidden references to the Eucharist.
Innanzitutto lui si dichiara discepolo del...
First of all, he declares himself the Good Shepherd of Christ, through which he received faith. Then he describes his trip to Rome. He came specifically to study the church, which he described as a queen dressed in gold, and the people, that is, Roman Christians of the time, who carried the sigils of faith.
Che portavano il sigillo della fede.
Scenes of Christ's Passion finally begin to evolve in the age of St. Francis of Assisi. He strongly identified with the suffering of Christ, and it was this devotion that inspired artists.
In the new climate of strongly emotional Franciscan spirituality of the 1260s and 70s and 80s, we begin to see depictions of the Passion of Christ in which the artist's intention is clearly to show us a real man whose body feels real pain, whose eyes look out at us with real beseeching that we at least share emotionally in his suffering and sustain him with our faith, with our fraternity.
One such example is the evocative Lamentation over the Dead Christ by Sandro Botticelli. But how can a painting that's over 500 years old continue to touch so deeply those who gaze upon it?
I think it is because just as Christ presents himself as the Son of God, but also the Son of Man, this kind of realistic Christian art speaks to that which is universal in human beings. Grief at the death of a loved one, grief at the death of a young friend, the grief of a mother for the death of her youthful son, the grief of a disciple for the death of a beloved teacher. These are dimensions of experience that are not unknown to us.
Another well-known Renaissance master, Michelangelo Buonarroti, invokes a deeply emotional response with his Pietà, carved when he was only 24. It was the first of 3 Pietas. He carved another much more personal one when he was in his 70s.
This is his most personal work of all those that he created. Indeed, it's the only work in which he includes a fully recognizable portrait of himself in a deeply emotional posture as the profoundly thoughtful man who lowers Christ from the cross into the arms of his mother.
Michelangelo portrayed himself as Nicodemus.
Michelangelo, who here wants to be seen as the one whom Christ has told how man can be born again. Man must be born from on high, Christ told Nicodemus. Here it is Michelangelo who, above the body of the dead Christ, lowers him into the arms of Christ's mother.
The work, which was left unfinished because of a flaw in the marble, was intended for his own tomb.
This work was meant to be an expression of an old man's mature faith in the Christ who himself had died but who rose and who could indeed help Michelangelo hope in a share in that resurrection.
Having just witnessed the violent death of their Lord, the followers of Christ feared for their lives. Distraught, they remained behind closed doors all day on Saturday.
Este día desemboca en la vigilia pascual, que introduce en el domingo más importante de la historia de la Pascua, el de la Pascua de Cristo. El cirio encendido en medio de la noche es símbolo de Cristo que resucita glorioso.
One Sunday, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb of Jesus to anoint the body. She found the tomb empty. Jesus had risen from the dead, and he appeared to Mary Magdalene first.
According to the Gospels, she is the first to see the resurrected Christ and the first to tell the apostles of the great mystery of the resurrection.
He later appeared to the 11.
So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God.
In Rome, the Pope celebrates the Easter Vigil at St. Peter's Basilica, starting on Saturday night with the ceremonial lighting of the Easter candle. During the ceremony, the Pope baptizes adults. The resurrection is the most important feast on the Christian liturgical calendar. So on Easter Sunday, the Pope announces to the world the resurrection of Jesus in more than 60 languages and imparts the blessing Urbi et Orbi to the city and the world.
His passion, death, and resurrection are the central mystery of Christian faith.
There could not be a greater act of love.
The Passion is the narrow door through which Christ himself has to pass in order to enter the kingdom of God, bringing with him all those who are willing to accept a share in his passion in order to have a share in his resurrection as well.
Deseo a todos una buena y feliz fiesta de Pascua, con la paz y la alegría, la esperanza y el amor de Jesucristo resucitado.